Well, let's talk about the aftermath of the tour. And I must say, you've unearthed some fabulous material from the MCC archives. Trevor Bailey wrote several books. Alan Hill wrote a biography of Trevor Bailey quite not so many years ago. And yet you've unearthed material that doesn't appear in any of these books. And
Yes.
Bailey himself has the most fabulous first day in the final test at Sabina Park. The groundsman tells Hutton, bat first and you'll score 700 on this. And the West Indies win the toss and bat first. Yeah. And Trevor Bailey bowls them, takes 7 wickets and bowls them out for next to nothing. And by the end of the day, he's opening the batting for England.
Yes.
So he's Hutton's double century you've spoken about, but Bailey as vice captain, absolutely crucial part in that final test. Talk a little bit about Trevor Bailey and about the aftermath of the tour in relation to him.
Absolutely. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Trevor Bailey. Obviously, not to everyone's taste. Some of his manner and some of the things he'd do in order to try and win a cricket match. He was the antithesis of Walter Robbins in the sense that he couldn't care 2 hoots about Brighton cricket. Winning cricket was all he was interested in. But I think he was a tremendous lieutenant to Hutton. There are different stories about how Hutton relaxed his attitude. Some people say Compton went to him. I think both of them did, to be honest. But Bailey held a dinner for some of the senior pros and sort of said, look, we've got to get behind Len Moore. And I accept he's got to loosen up. We've got to have a quid pro quo. There was all sorts of tension on the tour, by the way, between Compton and Evans and Trueman and Locke, which we might come back to if you've got time. So Bailey was a key figure there. As you say, in the 5th test, he also captained MCC to victory in Trinidad, which was very important. In those days, what were called the colony games were considered far more important. And MCC did a clean sweep of the colonies, which they'd never done before. And no England team has done since. Of course, nowadays, in an act of cultural vandalism, they don't play in half of these places, which I think is a tremendous shame. So he had a great tour. As you say, he took 7 for 34. He said he never forgot the look on Hutton's face when he lost the toss. But there was just a little bit of juice in the wicket. It had rained the week before. Johnny Wardle noticed indentations, when Bailey was bowling. And he bowled into the wind to give Trueman the end for the outswinger. And he took 7 for 34. And as you say, because of certain problems with the batting lineup, he then went out to open the batting. And he took all of the fast bowler, Frank King, he hit him on the jaw, etc., while Hutton sort of nodded approvingly from the other end, turning down singles to third man to keep out of the way. So, he was certainly the architect of that victory. And so when he came back to England, I think he was considered to be the obvious successor to Len Hutton when Hutton decided to retire, which was looking as if it was going to happen reasonably soon. The archive shows that basically he got into terrible difficulty with MCC. He foolishly published an article on the tour in a newspaper, in the People newspaper. And in those days, you weren't supposed to say anything or write anything about the tour for a year after it had taken place. And so he technically breached that rule. However, I think MCC's revenge in stripping him of the vice captaincy and giving it to Peter May was totally disproportionate and hypocritical, by the way, in that they, people like Warner and Robbins would often go on television and talk about selection and so on and so forth. It seems to me they wanted to get him because they felt, for a variety of reasons, he was sort of punching slightly above his station. He was, of course, an amateur. He was deputy secretary at Essex in a very common arrangement at that time. Charles Palmer was secretary at Leicestershire. But I think many people felt he played too much like a professional. I mean, the autobiography he published after the West Indies tour was called Playing to Win. And I think there were a few people at Lord's who wanted to get him. And they kind of got him on this technicality. A Conservative MP called Sir Hubert Ashton got involved. He was president of Essex. And they didn't see eye to eye at all because Bailey wanted to bring in a pools coupon scheme at Essex. And Hubert Ashton, who was a religious man, didn't want that to happen at all. And Gubby Allen and Trevor Bailey despised each other. I think it's fair to say. So that was a crucial thing as well. So I'm very grateful to people like Robert Curfey at the MCC Library who let me look at these documents, this to and fro where Bailey is being disciplined. And I think it's a terrible shame that he didn't become captain. I think unlike, say, Flintoff or Botham, who didn't rise to the challenge of being England captain, I think he would have been like Illingworth or Gregg. I think he'd have been a great England captain. Not that Peter May didn't do a very good job, actually, when he became captain. So that is a mini tragedy, I think, that Bailey was, what's the right word, blackballed for the most minor indiscretion.
Well, now we must go on to Fred Trueman and his role in the tour and what became of him afterwards.
I have slightly less sympathy for Trueman than I do for Bailey, but I do have to say, in fairness to you,
you did grow up in Yorkshire, didn't you? Before
I did. My father worked in Hull for about 10 years, so I learnt my cricket in Yorkshire. Of course, the East Riding of Yorkshire is not a homogenous place either. The East Riding is a slightly different place from the West Riding. And I have a great love for Yorkshire. I'm a supporter of Hull FC, Rugby League Club, and so on and so forth. So I have sympathy for Trueman in the sense he was 20, but we'll come to this in a minute. He had his 23rd birthday on tour. He says himself that apart from playing cricket, he'd never been further than Cleethorpes in his life. He was thrown into this atmosphere where he was expected to be on best behaviour all the time. And he found all of that social side, I think, very difficult. He's alleged to have said this famous story that he said to some a dignitary of Indian descent, "Pass the salt, Gunga Din." That's meant to have happened on this tour. I'm not so sure that did actually happen. But he got into enough trouble anyway, both on the pitch for not showing any remorse when he hit people with the ball. He felled 2 or 3 players and never seemed to say sorry. But also off the pitch at functions, he got into a lot of trouble. And the incident for which he got into most trouble for, Hutton decided to room Trueman with Tony Locke, another rather incandescent young character. Jim Laker described this as a gross managerial blunder. I think the idea was, I was very lucky to speak to Alan Moss before he died, a wonderful man who roomed with Jim Laker on that tour. And he told me that he felt Hutton deliberately did it to try and sort of get them stewing together in their room, And unfortunately, it didn't have great effect. So during the first test, England anyway had what they call a club night on Friday. Where they had a few drinks and a few fines meted out in rum and beer and so on. And it was Trueman's 23rd birthday. On the next day, Hutton knocked on his door and said, "I'm afraid we've had a complaint from a lady who is the wife of an MCC member, who claims that someone was pushing a food trolley up and down the corridor and then pushed it into the lift, manhandled her in the lift and started swearing at her." And Locke and Trueman were, pointed the finger at, so they had to go and have a dressing down. Swanson writes a very funny account because Swanson was invited to sort of be the diplomat. And they took their medicine. And then Hutton said, "Well, I thought you took that very well, Fred." And he's alleged to have said, "Well, so did I, since it weren't us." Because they said that it was Compton and Evans who'd done it. I don't think we'll ever know who did do it. But Trueman was connected with that sort of behaviour throughout the tour. And I think it's fair to say that his head was somewhat put on a platter by Hutton and Palmer, I think reading between the lines, to try and placate Lords, to stop Lords chopping off some more heads. So Trueman was the only player on tour to be docked his good conduct bonus of £50, which he was always extremely sore about. And he was effectively banned from touring for 5 years. He didn't go on another tour for 5 years. He never played under a professional captain again. And I think some people at MCC to, well, look, this is what happens when you let a professional captain be in charge of the troops. he just can't keep them under control. So it was a tricky thing. But I did find something else in the Lord Archive, actually, which I might just read out if we've time. His card was already marked by Lords, if I can find it, in that Colonel Rate Kerr, who was just about to retire as secretary at Lords, wrote a little memo in a file at Lords in 1952. And he said, it was mentioned to me first by Admiral Norris, who is chairman of the Combined Services Cricket Association, at a luncheon party attended by the First Lord of the Admiralty, several Sea Lords and members of the Air Council and Army Council. Admiral Norris said that he had never thought he would live to have a complaint lodged by one of the Indian touring team during the Combined Services match at Chatham to the effect that the Indian players felt perfectly disgusted with Trueman's language. So his card was marked already, and he'd done two very bad things there. He'd upset the very high brass. Of course, Trueman was in the RAF, but you've got these high-ranking officers being told by Indians, of all people, that Trueman's behaviour was out of order. I think you quote that wonderful phrase of Geoffrey Howard, didn't he? Overheard Colonel Rate Kerr say that I can't stand educated Indians. So there was that kind of attitude at Lords at that time. I mean, it's unbelievable to us now, isn't it, in the 21st century, that attitude prevailed. But I think Trueman's card was already marked, even before he went on that tour, for bad language and for upsetting, how can we put it, friends in the Commonwealth. So I think they were ready to get him anyway, even before his bad behaviour on the tour. And there's no doubt he didn't behave particularly well. So he didn't go. As it happened more for cricketing reasons, Laker and Locke didn't go. And then Bedser, in a story you probably haven't got time for today, through a combination of illness and other things, was dropped for Tyson, in the Melbourne game in 54, 55. So extraordinarily, the four great bowlers who won the Ashes at the Oval in 53, Trueman, Laker, Locke, Bedser, none of them bowled in the three test matches where we won the Ashes in 54, 55. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
It is, yes. And that 1 year after this tour to the West Indies, after a home series against Pakistan, we're off to Australia. And Trueman, you quote this extraordinary saga where Trueman isn't asked whether he's available,
yes.
But they don't want to admit this. And at one stage, they say something to the Yorkshire Secretary, John Nash.
Yeah, it's extremely difficult to know what happened. I mean, what I think we do know is that Gubby Allen and people like E.W. Swanton were determined to eliminate Trueman from that tour. And I don't think, to be honest, Hutton was too bothered.
No.
Because he knew that Brian, as he said himself, Brian was always a grand lad. He could rely on Statham, the most equable of fast bowlers. I hope Statham is another hero of this book. I just have nothing but good time for Brian Statham. Hutton was sort of okay about Trueman not going, I think. But there's this very convoluted set of things that happen in the minutes. Where is he sent an availability letter? Isn't he sent an availability letter? Trueman later recalled that John Nash, the Yorkshire secretary, told him that he had been sent a letter, but he'd forgotten to give it to him. But I have a feeling there was some collusion between Gubby Allen and Brian Sellers, usually unhappy bedfellows, of course, to sort of pretend that Trueman was being considered, when in fact they decided they weren't going to take him under any circumstances. And Altham, the chairman of selectors, Harry Altham, took the unusual step in those days of telling the press that Trueman was not being eliminated for non-cricketing reasons, which no one quite believed at the time. But there's a very, it's impossible to say exactly how they did it, but I think they decided very early in the year, Warner, Allen, Robbins, these kind of people, that there was no way Trueman was going to go on that tour.
And then, of course, the big one, do we take Hutton as captain to Australia?
Yes. It's been written about a lot of times, obviously, the attempted coup where David Shepherd might be installed. Shepherd, I must say, doesn't come out of it terribly well, in that he was approached by a combination of Walter Robbins and Errol Holmes, who was captain of Surrey in the 1930s. he happened to get very badly barracked by a Yorkshire crowd when Hutton, for the only time, was dropped from the England team. So that may have had something to do with it. But they basically...
And that's a very good story, though, isn't it? Because they thought he was the chairman of selectors, and it wasn't him at all. It was another Holmes.
I mean, the Bramall Lane crowd, I think, was discerning enough. I think they were pretending that he was, in fact, A.J. Holmes of Sussex, who was the chairman of selectors.
Well, just anyway, before you go on, it is a fabulous story, and that book, Flannelled Foolishness by Errol Holmes, is actually rather a good read, and he writes the story up brilliantly. And this is the point to plug the fact that your research on this book has been so wonderful, and it brims with stuff. And in the end, it just simply wasn't possible to put a story like that into the book. And you've created this tremendous website that goes alongside the book, where you reveal all your sources and further material, which you're still adding to. And so you've got a book with a tremendous story in it and so much research in it. And then people want to go into the scholarship of it, go to the website, and heaps more.
I mean, the website, I hope, will be a living thing in that, first of all, I can correct the inevitable mistakes that I've made, but I hope that I'll sort of keep that. It depends how much energy I have, I suppose, and how much people like the book, but keep that going. But yes, so to get back to this, thank you for mentioning that. To get back to the story, it was I have to say, even by the standards of the day, quite a conspiratorial affair where some people come out better than others. I don't think Ronnie Aird, the secretary of MCC, comes out of it very well at all, and nor does he come out well actually from the Bailey affair. And it was a very close run thing. And Wisden said that Hutton had won the vote of the Selectorial Committee by one vote in its 1955 edition or 56 edition, can't remember which one. And then the next year, Lord's MCC told them to put an errata in to say, we said last year it was by one vote. MCC has informed us that he was voted unanimously. so make of that what you will. But I've decided that I think the key figure may have been Harry Alton, in that the selection committee in 54 consisted of Robbins, Allen, and I think it's safe to say they were Shepherd people. Shepherd, incidentally, had sort of said to himself, I shouldn't really stop my course, but if God really wants me to captain England, I would accept going if they made me captain. I wouldn't go if I wasn't captain. Whereas Hutton said he would go as vice captain to Shepherd. So there's an interesting difference to begin with. So Robbins and Alton, I think, definitely voted, if there was a vote, for Shepherd. Also on the committee were Palmer, who I think was naturally sympathetic to Hutton and would have voted for him. Norman Yardley, his Yorkshire captain, who I think almost certainly would have voted for him. And Les Ames, who was the first professional to sit with permanent tenure on the committee. So I think they were Hutton men. So Alton almost has a casting vote, because if he goes, with Robbins and Allen, he was a close friend of Allen. Allen had sort of admitted him to the inner circle by making him treasurer over and above Pelham Warner's candidate. Alton, I think, if he'd have not wanted Hutton, I think that would have been it. And I think Alton, for a variety of reasons, partly because I think he liked Glenn Hutton and respected him, partly because he was the only chairman of selectors, I think, in the history of the role. I mean, whether they'll bring it back now after all this fiasco now, I don't know. But I think I'm right in saying he's the only chairman of selectors who was neither a test match player or captain of his county. Even A.J. Holmes of Sussex, captained Sussex for a while. So I think it was, he really did want to beat Australia as well. This tension again between diplomacy and winning. So my feeling is that Alton may have been the key man who saved Hutton, if to be dramatic about it for a moment. I can't be sure about that. But Hutton only survived by the skin of his teeth. And then, of course, the rest is history. I mean, he had a much better backup team than in, only by accident. MCC didn't help him much, as you famously pointed out in your book about Geoffrey Howard. I think Geoffrey Howard said, MCC gave me everything except the two things I actually needed, help and money. they forgot to wire him funds, didn't they? And so, but Hutton had Geoffrey Howard, who I think understood him and worked with him much better than Palmer did. That's no reflection on Palmer's integrity. I think Howard was just better at the job, and of course didn't have to play any cricket. Well, he played in an up-country game, but and then he had George Duckworth as scorer, baggage man, general, guru, who I think Hutton was very close to. He had no one like that in the West Indies you could talk to. He was very close to the masseur, Harold Dalton, who they'd wanted to take to the West Indies, but the West Indies board said we haven't got the budget for that. And he had Jim Kilburn as his kind of unofficial press liaison man. He had nobody like that in the West Indies. He had to deal with the press all by himself. He was pestered by them in hotels and so on and so forth. Although actually, officially, he wasn't supposed to speak to the press at all. You know, the MCC gave him those instructions, but then expected him to deal with the press at the same time. So Hutton had a much better support team in 54, 55. He had a lot of luck. And then, of course, he had Tyson and Statham and Colin Cowdrey, who he and Allen, for once in agreement, had decided to select. But I still think it was a magnificent achievement, considering everything he'd been through, all the stress of the West Indies tour, the stress of people trying to get rid of him, for him to triumph in Australia, even though he was actually becoming past his best as a batsman himself. An incredible achievement. And as he said himself, I mean, he was the only captain between Jardine in 32, 33 and Illingworth in 70, 71 to win in Australia. And as he said proudly himself, I think when he was interviewed by Donald Trelford, you know, we won without leaving a smell. Now, of course, it's easier not to leave a smell in Australia, which had a white Australia policy at that time and probably identified with a professional captain, than it is in the West Indies, where we had all these issues of colonialism going on and the local white population wanted an amateur captain. But I think Hutton's triumph we sort of end the English section of the book with Hutton's triumph in Australia. And recent events only show what a triumph it was. Particularly after going one down. He did what Nasser Hussain did, for those of you who don't remember. He put them in Brisbane and they proceeded to score 500 and something. I think Keith Andrew got an extremely difficult chance of Arthur Morris in the first over because Godfrey Evans had tonsillitis or something. And so they lost the first test by an innings. So to come back from there is one of the great achievements in cricket, I would say, in Test cricket.
Yes. Well, it's a fabulous ending to the book. And you also end with later developments in the West Indies and leading up to the appointment of the first black captain in Frank Worrell.
Yes. It's more difficult in the West Indies because the West Indies Board of Control have never made minutes available, if they even took minutes. Whereas even though the minutes at Lords are very dry, you know, they're very, you can read between the lines. It's much more difficult in the West Indies to understand all the politics, some of which was inter-island, you know, Barbados against Jamaica, Jamaica against Trinidad. There was a lot of inter-island rivalry, which is extremely complex, and which I hope the book talks about. Some of it was more inter-race, in that obviously the oligarchy, if you want to call them that, whatever the right word is, the local whites still basically controlled the Board of Control. But clearly nationalist people, be they, always hard to know what the right terminology is, but be they black or be they from Indian communities, were obviously pressing for more representation. You also have some tension in what was then British Guyana between the African and the Indian communities, and to a lesser extent in Trinidad. So there's lots of complex stuff going on. But despite the fact that Worrell was Stollmeyer's vice captain in 1953-54, and indeed he took over on the pitch in Trinidad, and indeed allowed his fast bowler to bowl very short at Jim Laker. Jim Laker was taken to hospital with a big cut over his eye. But it took another 7 years for Worrell to become captain of the West Indies, 6 years. We had a succession of white captains after Stollmeyer. First of all, Dennis Atkinson, then Goddard came back for 57, then Jerry Alexander. Jerry Alexander, actually a very admirable person. He eventually became vice captain to Worrell in Australia. But I try and go through all the things, you know, the problems in the game and the time it took. And it eventually, Worrell becomes captain almost exactly at the time that the West Indian Islands finally become independent. But significantly, the great hope in the region was that they'd come to independence in federation, and that made a lot of sense in some ways. It's reminiscent of all the stuff about Brexit today in terms of the arguments about whether they should have done it or not. But that federation collapsed very quickly, just at the time that Worrell was really uniting the Test team. And of course, although he lost in Australia in 60-61, he had Duckworth, by the way, as his scorer baggageman as well. Duckworth was in demand for that role. Duckworth had been his manager when he captained the Commonwealth. Someone should write a good book about Duckworth, I think, if there's enough information available. But Worrell triumphed in a way because the cricket was much brighter than it had been in the 1950s, the famous tie test and so forth. And then, as some of you will remember, I wasn't alive then, but I would like to have been, Stephen, and I think it was one of the first series that made an impression on you, or certainly 66. But in 63, Worrell beat Dexter 3-1, playing for the most part. I mean, don't misunderstand the fact that West Indies could be very hard as well, but won 3-1 and kind of put a breath of fresh air through English cricket at exactly the time, of course, lots of things were changing in English society. It was the year of the Profumo scandal. Didn't Philip Larkin say that in 1963 sexual intercourse began? Well, so did the Gillette Cup. It was a big year for English cricket, and somehow
between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP, I think that's how it goes.
Yes. So the book ends with it starts with the West Indies winning in 1950 and Hutton winning the Ashes in 53, and it ends with Hutton winning the Ashes in Australia and Worrell winning the first Wisden Trophy in England. Those are the journeys, I think, that the English cricket and West Indian cricket went on. And we probably had enough time today to talk about all the intricacies, particularly in the Caribbean, which are fascinating, all the different characters and the inter-island rivalries, and of course some of the things that to a modern sensibility are just extraordinary in terms of racial prejudice and racial injustice.
Yes, well, I think we'd better stop there, David. We've overrun and left far too little time for our people to ask questions. But I think just listening to you talking, I'm sure the people online will realise just what a fabulous achievement this book is. The way you have such command of so many issues at so many levels and interweave them so beautifully. And the prose is so beautifully written throughout. The sentences sparkle and in a nice unshowy way. I love the whole thing. I think it's a fabulous book, and you've focused in on one tour, and yet the meanings flare out so far beyond that tour, as you've just demonstrated. So here we are. Here's the book. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you. Thank both of you. Here is the book. And it's a wonderfully produced book as well. Beautifully, it's got all the stamp of a Stephen Chalke book. I know Stephen's less involved than he used to be.
Well, it is Fairfield Books. It's the publishing house that I've sold to the people who produce Wisden Cricket Monthly and the Night Watchman, and I can't think of a better bridge from the work I did to their taking over the publishing house for this to be one of their first titles alongside Shield Berry's new book. I think I glow with joy that they've taken this book on and done it as they have.